The first thing they got wrong about us was that we would break. That assumption that humans, pressed hard enough against the edge of extinction, would fracture along the seams of faith and science. And all the old arguments that had never quite finished killing each other was the miscalculation that cost the Verath everything they thought they knew. They had studied us for 100 years before they came. They had watched us argue through telescopes and sensor arrays and the infinitely patient instruments of beings who had nothing better to do with a century than watch another species make a mess of itself. They had cataloged every schism, every war fought in the name of God or progress, or the correct interpretation of a text nobody had actually read in 3 generations. They had seen us burn each other's libraries and bomb each other's hospitals and stand in the rubble of a civilization we had spent centuries constructing, arguing about who got to rebuild it first. They thought we were already broken. They were wrong. My name is Joshua Harlan Morrow. I was 67 years old when the unmaking order was formally revoked, and I have been trying ever since to explain what happened in a way that makes sense to people who were not there. The problem is that the story, told straight, sounds too small. A man on a sidewalk with a cup of coffee, a column of iridescent smoke with the authority to end 8 billion lives, a conversation that turned on a single word. It does not sound like the kind of story that saves a species, but most of the stories that actually matter are that small. I should back up. The planet did not end on a Tuesday, though that is how I always think of it. The Tuesday the sky went copper-colored over Los Angeles and the first Vareth ship came down over the Pacific like a falling cathedral, slow and enormous, and so far beyond anything our engineers had managed that half the people watching from the shore did not understand what they were seeing. They thought it was a storm system, a military exercise, a film production with an exceptionally generous budget. The woman standing next to me on the Santa Monica Pier, a woman with paint-stained fingers and a thermos of coffee and the specific calm expression of someone who has decided that the morning is too nice to be interrupted, watched the ship descend through the cloud bank and said quietly to no one in particular, "Well, there it is then." She was right. There it was. The Varath did not open fire immediately. That was the first surprise, and it unsettled people more than the shooting would have, because we had prepared in the particular way that a species prepares for the things it has imagined for a long time, for the version where they came shooting. We had not prepared for the version where they simply arrived and waited. The ship just hung there, 3 miles wide and blotting out the western sun, and the city went quiet in the specific way that cities only go quiet when they have no idea what comes next. Car alarms stopped, dogs stopped barking, traffic slowed, not because of a signal, but because drivers were looking up instead of forward, and there was, for the first time in living memory, nothing on the horizon worth looking at more than the thing in the sky. The woman with the paint-stained fingers poured the rest of her coffee into the ocean and started walking back toward the shore, with the purposeful stride of someone who has just decided she has a great deal to do. I watched the ship for another hour. The Varath made contact 48 hours after our arrival, by which point there were 6 more ships positioned over 6 more population centers on 6 different continents, and the governments of the world were doing what governments do in such situations: meeting. The rooms where those meetings happened became, over the following months, the most intensely managed and least informative rooms in human history. Transcripts were released with the careful precision of documents designed to communicate nothing while appearing to communicate everything. Spokespeople spoke. Briefings were briefed. The diplomatic apparatus of 23 nations produced, in those early weeks, a remarkable quantity of paper that said approximately, "We are aware of the situation and it is being handled." The Vareth transmission was brief, polished, and delivered in 17 languages simultaneously, with an accent so neutral it sounded like a language that had never been spoken by anyone who had ever been angry about anything. They had come, they said, to make an assessment. They had been monitoring our species for some time. They were here to determine whether we were, in their terminology, coherent enough to be worth preserving. What coherent meant, we would learn over the following 18 months. It was not the word anyone would have chosen, given the choice. It turned out to mean something very specific in Vareth usage, and the specificity of it was the thing that nobody quite understood until it was almost too late. I was not involved in any of the diplomatic contacts. I want to be clear about that, because in the years since, there has been a tendency, understandable maybe, given how it ended, to retrofit narrative onto what happened, to make it seem like there was a plan, a protagonist, a moment of decision. There was no plan. What there was, instead, was a set of circumstances so unlikely that Achebe himself, who spent his entire professional life arranging unlikely circumstances, would have been surprised by how it resolved. I was a graduate student in computational biology at UCLA, 26 years old, with a dissertation half finished on genetic regulatory networks and a small apartment in Silver Lake, and a coffee habit that my advisor described, in her annual review of my progress, as the only thing about me that showed genuine commitment. I knew about the Verith the same way everyone else knew, through the news, through rumor, through the fragmented and contradictory reports that filtered through 17 layers of government press offices before reaching the public, at which point they were so scrubbed of content that they communicated nothing except the general impression that the people in charge were very confident and had no idea what was happening. I was not a military man. I was not a diplomat. I was not a hero in any of the recognized senses. I was a 26-year-old with a dead mentor's notes and a half-formed theory, and as it turned out, the exact cognitive architecture that the situation required. Which brings me to the part I always tell badly. I was not born. I was grown in a lab on the 4th floor of a building in Pasadena that was registered with the county as a biomedical research facility, and which was, in fact, a biomedical research facility, which just tells you something about the gaps in regulatory oversight when the people doing the regulation and the people doing the research have overlapping calendars. The project had a name, Project Clarity, and a mandate that, depending on who you asked, was either visionary or monstrous, or just the kind of thing that happens when a brilliant and sleep-deprived neuroscientist stares at images of hippocampal structure for long enough without taking a proper vacation. Dr. Bernard Ashby was, by the time I met him, an old man who had been sick for 2 years and was still working, because the work had become the thing that organized the remaining time, and he was not ready to let the time become unorganized. He had spent 30 years developing, and then abandoning, and then redeveloping a theory about human consciousness that the mainstream scientific community regarded with a particular mixture of respect and embarrassment that communities reserve for the genuinely original ideas they cannot quite find the grounds to dismiss. The theory was called bridging cognition, though Achebe himself disliked the term. He had used it once in a paper, and the name had stuck the way names stick when other people find them more convenient than what the originator intended. The core of it was simple enough, though the implications were not. Achebe believed that human consciousness, the specific quality of human consciousness that distinguished us from every other cognitive system we had so far encountered, including the cognitive systems we had built ourselves, was organized around a particular kind of tension, not a contradiction to be resolved, a structural opposition to be inhabited, the tension between what could be measured and what could be meant, between the empirical and the numinous, between the formula and the prayer. Every other known cognitive architecture, he argued, artificial or biological, operated by reducing this tension, by finding, over time, a dominant mode and subordinating the other. You became either a scientist who treated the numinous as noise, or a believer who treated the empirical as approximation. Even in people who thought they held both, there was usually under examination a home frequency, a mode that organized everything else and explained the other mode to itself. What Achebe had found, in a subset of his research subjects too small to constitute a statistically significant sample. He knew this, and said so, which was the kind of scientific honesty that did not make him popular, was an architectural variant. Individuals for whom neither mode was dominant, individuals for whom the tension itself was the organizing structure, who did not experience the gap between science and faith as a problem to be solved or a limitation to be managed, but as the native condition of consciousness, the space they lived in, a country rather than a corridor. He thought this was the thing that would matter. He did not know why, exactly. He knew it with the particular quality of knowing that comes from 30 years of looking at a problem and understanding it at a level that precedes formal articulation. He thought it was the thing the species needed. In some direction he could not fully specify, and so he did what scientists do when they think something is the thing the species needs. He tried to make it deliberately. 8 of us, grown from selected genetic configurations, placed with families chosen for their stability and their capacity for ordinary love, given the lives most likely to develop the architecture without distorting it. I was the second. My family was in Silver Lake. My father repaired watches in a workshop behind the kitchen with the precise and patient attention of a man who had decided that making broken things work again was a life well spent. My mother taught high school chemistry and graded papers at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings with a red pen she had been using since before I was born. Our apartment smelled of solder and coffee, and the particular kind of peace that settles over spaces where people have made their peace with, the ordinary. I loved them completely. I still do. I did not know about Project Clarity until I was 23, when a chiefy found me through an alumni network and asked to meet. The diner on Sunset Boulevard was the kind of place that had been there for 40 years and would be there for 40 more, the kind of place that held the memory of a million conversations in its vinyl and formica, and did not make any claims about it. We sat in a booth by the window, and he told me everything over 2 cups of coffee and a plate of toast that neither of us touched. When he finished, I sat with it for a while. The coffee had gone cold. "What am I supposed to do with this?" I said. "I don't know," he said. "That's why I'm telling you." "You built me," I said. "I gave you a configuration," he said. "What you built is your own. Is there a reason you're telling me now? Is something happening?" He looked out the window at the Sunset Boulevard traffic. A woman in a yellow coat was crossing against the light with the absolute confidence of someone who has done it 1,000 times and been right every time. He watched her clear the intersection and reach the sidewalk and keep walking. "I'm running out of time," he said, "and I have a feeling you're going to need to know." He died 8 months later. The Vareth arrived 4 months after that. The assessment period was 18 months. The criteria were not fully disclosed. The diplomatic corps spent considerable effort trying to extract specifics, and what they got back was a series of responses that were precise and completely unhelpful. The intellectual equivalent of being told the exam covers everything. The 43 Vareth observers, they sent exactly 43, distributed across population centers on 6 continents, each one looking like nothing, so much as a column of iridescent smoke held in the vague shape of a person by some kind of organizational will, moved through our cities with the patient attention of beings who have a great deal of time and know how to use it. They attended religious services of every tradition. They attended lectures and conferences and symposia. They sat in city council meetings in the back rows and watched us argue about parking regulations with the same attentiveness they gave to things that actually mattered. They watched us play football and attend funerals and walk dogs at 7 in the morning and stay up too late watching things we had already seen. The observers did not speak unless spoken to in those early months. When they did speak, it was precise and uninflected and free of anything that could be mistaken for opinion. They did not answer questions about the assessment criteria. They did not answer questions about the Varath themselves. They answered factual questions about the mechanics of the process, the timeline, the format of the announcement, the channels through which results would be communicated, with the reliability of a very expensive automated information system. People who tried to engage them in actual conversation reported that the conversations tended to end quickly, not because the observer withdrew, but because it answered each question so fully and precisely that there were no follow-up questions. I tried it once, in the 2nd month, standing outside the Ukulele main library on a Thursday afternoon, when an observer had been stationary on the steps for about 40 minutes watching students move in and out. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "We are assessing coherence," it said. "What does that mean, exactly?" "The degree to which a species has resolved its fundamental internal contradictions, the compatibility of its cognitive and cultural architectures, the probability of long-term stability. And if we're not coherent, then you are assessed accordingly." Accordingly meaning, the assessment outcome is determined by the assessment. The outcome is not predetermined. This was, I would realize later, not evasion. It was a genuinely accurate description of a process the Varath believed to be objective, conducted by beings who had spent 4,000 years in the confidence of a framework that had never been seriously challenged. The assessment was not predetermined. The problem was that the framework was. I was at the public forum in downtown Los Angeles in the 7th month of the assessment period. It was one of a series of town halls the diplomatic corps had organized, either as a genuine transparency measure or as a data collection exercise, or as both, the way most institutional gestures manage to be both honest and self-serving simultaneously. The venue was a convention center that smelled of carpet cleaner and old coffee, and it was full because the situation had not yet produced the paralysis that would come later in the months after the announcement. In the 7th month, people were still engaged, still arriving in the posture of people who believe that showing up matters. There were 3 observers at the back of the room. The panel of diplomats at the front had the exhausted composure of people doing something important and impossible, which is the only way to do something important and impossible, and I respected them for it. The question period had been running for 40 minutes and had covered the usual territory, the criteria, the timeline, the resources being directed toward what various speakers called our case, as though the assessment were a legal proceeding and we were about to present evidence. Then a man in the third row stood up. He was gray-haired, in his late 70s at a guess, and he carried a Bible with a cracked spine and the specific worn quality of a book that has been read rather than displayed. Not a performance prop, an actual book with the soft corners and darkened edges of decades of handling. He wore a cardigan the color of a winter sky, and he had the posture of a man who has spent a long life standing in rooms and speaking carefully, and has no intention of stopping. He addressed the observer nearest him, not the panel, the observer. He turned to face it directly, the way you turn to face the person you are actually speaking to. Do you believe in God? He said. Not provocatively, not as a challenge or a trap or a rhetorical strategy. The room went quiet with the specific quality of a room that has just heard something asked, with genuine, undefended curiosity. He asked it the way you ask someone at a dinner party what they do for a living, with actual interest in the answer and no investment in what the answer would be. The observer took a moment, not the kind of moment that comes from processing lag, the kind that comes from encountering a question in a frame you were not prepared for. The Varath do not require the concept, it said, in its precise and neutral voice. We have resolved the underlying questions by other means. What underlying questions? The man asked. The questions that generate the requirement, the observer said. Purpose, origin, coherence of the self within the larger pattern. These are questions that arise from incoherence. When coherence is achieved, the questions dissolve. There was a pause. The man looked at the observer with the expression of someone who has just been shown something he expected to find moving, and finds in fact moving. That sounds lonely, he said. I want to try to describe what happened in that room, because I have thought about it for 60 years, and I am still not sure I can do it precisely. It was not silence. The room was not silent. There was the sound of ventilation and the distant traffic outside, and the shifting of a few hundred people in plastic chairs. It was more like a collective recognition, the way a room full of people recognizes a piece of music they know without being able to name. Not an event, exactly, but a resonance. The man had said something simple and true, and said it without armor, and the room felt it. The observer was quiet for longer than it had ever been quiet in any interaction I had witnessed. When it spoke again, there was something in its voice that had not been there before, a quality like static, or the way a clear signal sounds when it passes through something dense. The Varath do not experience loneliness, it said. I know, the man said. That's what I mean. He sat down. The forum moved on, because forums move on even when the most important thing has just been said. But I watched the observer for the remaining hour of the meeting, and what I saw was what I can only describe as a form learning something about its own edges. The column of iridescent smoke that composed its shape shifted in ways I had not seen before, not dramatically, not with the urgency of damage or distress, but with the subtle, continuous movement of something that is reassessing its own internal state and finding the inventory more complicated than expected. When the meeting ended and people were filing out, the observer drifted through the crowd toward me. I had not spoken. I had not done anything that should have identified me as worth approaching, but it stopped 2 feet away, and the iridescence of its form caught the fluorescent light in a way that seemed to have too many colors for fluorescent light to produce. You are unusual, it said. I get that a lot, I said. Your cognitive architecture does not match the standard human parameters we have cataloged. That's a very particular thing to notice. We observe directly, it said. You hold contradiction without resolution. Most humans do this as a temporary state, a stage on the way to decision, to the adoption of a dominant mode. For you, it is not a stage. It is a structure. Your cognitive baseline is organized around the tension itself. Is that good or bad? That, the observer said, is what we are trying to determine. I stood in the emptying convention center for a long time after it left. Outside, the man with the worn Bible was walking toward the parking structure with his hands in the pockets of his cardigan, moving through the Los Angeles night with the ease of someone who has walked through it 10,000 times and is not afraid of any of it. I caught up with him at the elevator. Thomas Okafor, he said, and put out his hand. Joshua Morrow, I said. You were watching The Observer after I spoke, he said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation, delivered with the precision of someone who has spent a long time paying attention to what other people notice. It changed, I said. Yes, he said. It did. We rode down to the parking level together in the specific silence of people who have just witnessed something and are deciding whether to talk about it. When the doors opened, he looked at me with an expression I recognized from something, from the mirror, maybe, or from the faces of people I had liked most in my life, and said, "Come to church sometime if you want, we have coffee." He walked to his car. I stood in the garage for a while. The assessment period ended 3 months later. The announcement was delivered through the same diplomatic channels, in 17 languages, with the same neutral precision. Humanity, the Varath said, was incoherent. The fundamental incompatibility between our scientific and metaphysical frameworks had not been resolved and showed no signs of imminent resolution. The internal contradictions in human cognitive and cultural architecture represented a destabilizing element incompatible with the long-term stability of the systems they maintained. The date of the unmaking was set for 8 months from the announcement. The first week was bad. I do not want to spend too long in it, because some things resist description for good reason. What I can say is this. The city did not collapse, which surprised some people, surprised none of the people who had actually been paying attention. Cities are structures built by creatures who have survived things before and want to survive more things. And the structural impulse persists even when the rational analysis says it probably won't work out. The panaderia on the corner of my block opened at 6 in the morning, the same as always. The dog on my street went for its walk. The woman in the apartment above me played music at a level that was technically within the building's noise ordinance, which had always been her approach. I spent the first 3 days in my apartment, eating cereal and reading. I read physics, and I read theology, and I read poetries, and I read Achibi's published papers and the notes he had left me, which I had been reading, and not quite reading since his death. Circling around the center of them without quite landing on it, the way you circle around a thing you are not ready to confront directly. I thought about what the Observer had said about my cognitive architecture. I thought about what Thomas Okafor had said about loneliness. I thought about the bird that had flown into my mother's window when I was 4 years old, and about the fact that I had sat next to it for an entire afternoon, and not known until 30 years later that it had survived. On the 4th day, I called my mother. She answered on the 2nd ring. She always answered on the 2nd ring, with the unhurried precision of a woman who had decided early in her life that she would not be the kind of person who let calls go to voicemails just because she was in the middle of something. The something could wait. The person couldn't. "How are you doing?" she asked. "I'm okay," I said. "Mom, do you believe in God?" The pause was brief. The kind of pause that comes not from uncertainty, but from giving a question the weight it deserves. "I believe in you," she said. "Does that count?" I was quiet for a moment. "I think it might." "Are you going to do something?" she said. "I think I'm going to try." "Good," she said. "The coffee in that apartment is not going to be improved by sitting next to it. Go out. Do something." On the 5th day, I went to find the Observer. They were not difficult to find. The 43 had not relocated after the announcement, either because they had no reason to, or because they were giving us something, the specific something of not hiding. My Observer was moving through Silver Lake the way it always had, in its slow drift, watching. The neighborhood was doing what neighborhoods do when the world is ending, keeping going. The panaderia was open. The woman with the paint-stained fingers. I had learned by then that her name was Elena, and that she lived 4 blocks from me, and that she was one of the most attentive people I had ever met, had her front door open. Canvas visible, working. I stepped in front of the Observer on a Tuesday morning with the Pacific light coming in flat and gold through the gap between buildings. "I want to make an argument," I said. "The assessment period has concluded," it said. "I know. I want to make it anyway." A long pause. The iridescence shifted. "Then proceed." I took a breath. What I argued, standing on a Silver Lake sidewalk with the city carrying on around me in all its noise and beauty and insistence, was this. The Varath had assessed human incoherence as a flaw, as a developmental failure, a failure to reach the coherence they had achieved 4,000 years ago. I understood why. Seen from outside, the gap between our empirical and numinous frameworks looked like a wound that had not healed. It looked like a species still in argument with itself about the most fundamental questions, unable to arrive at the settled peace that coherence promised. But they were wrong about what the gap was. The coherence the Varath had achieved was real and impressive, and I had no desire to diminish it. 4,000 years of stable, careful stewardship of a galaxy was not a trivial accomplishment. The answer they had found was a real answer. The resolution was a genuine resolution, but a resolved answer was a closed system, a fixed point. And fixed points, however sophisticated, could not encounter genuinely new questions, because the architecture that generated the question was the same architecture that had already concluded there were no new questions to be generated. The Varath could not be surprised. Not genuinely surprised, not in the way that requires the fundamental framework to flex, to accommodate something that does not fit the existing structure, to be changed by the encounter rather than simply registering it. The Varath could receive new data, they could process new configurations, but genuine surprise, the surprise that requires you to revise what you thought you knew about the shape of things, was not available to them. Their coherence had closed the door that genuine surprise requires open. Human incoherence, the permanent, unresolved, generative friction between our science and our faith, between what we could measure and what we could feel, between the empirical and the numinous, was not a failure to achieve what the Varath had achieved. It was a different architecture entirely. It was a system that stayed open, a system maintained in a state of productive tension by two modes of engagement with reality that could not fully subsume each other and had, over 100,000 years of trying, produced, instead of resolution, an extraordinary capacity for encountering the genuinely new and being genuinely changed by it. We were not incoherent in the sense of being disorganized. We were unfinished in the sense of being alive, and unfinished things could still become anything. The Varath had spent 4,000 years assuming that coherence was the destination, that every species was working, consciously or not, toward the settled piece of resolved contradiction. We were not working toward it, we were something else, something that had organized itself around the tension rather than the resolution, something for which the gap between the molecule and the miracle was not a wound to be healed, but a country to be lived in, something that could look at a dying bird on a windowsill and sit with it all afternoon, not because it had an answer, but because it understood that some things deserve company while they are figuring out whether to fly. The observer was quiet for a very long time. Around me, the city continued. A child went by on a bicycle. The panaderia sent its morning smell down the block. Elena appeared in her doorway with a paintbrush held loosely and watched us. Me in the column of impossible light, with the composed attention she brought to everything worth looking at. This argument, the observer said at last, has been made before, by other species, in other assessment periods. What happened to them? They were assessed as incoherent and unmade. Was the argument wrong? A long pause. The iridescence shifted in a way I had not seen before. Larger, slower, the way light shifts before weather. The argument was not evaluated on its merits, the observer said. It was evaluated as further evidence of incoherence. The inability to accept a concluded assessment was taken as confirmation of the assessment. That's circular, I said. Yes, the observer said. And then it said something that I have carried in my chest ever since, that sits in me the way certain pieces of music sit in you, the ones that found the right frequency. Yes, it is. The consultation lasted 22 days. The observer found me on the 23rd morning at Elena's kitchen table. She had started making coffee for me in the mornings, without discussion, the way certain people offer certain things without making them a question, and told me that the assessment body had reviewed the argument and found significant divergence of position. Some members held that the argument reaffirmed the original finding. Incoherence articulating a theory of incoherence's value was still incoherence, and the confidence with which the species argued for its own survival was itself evidence of the instability being assessed. Other members had noted something different. They had noted that the argument was, in a technical sense, surprising, that the specific framing, coherence of questions versus coherence of answers, the structural distinction between a closed and an open system, was not a configuration the Varath assessment body had previously encountered, that a species which could produce, in response to a concluded assessment, a genuinely new argument, not a refutation within the existing framework, but a challenge to the framework itself, had demonstrated at minimum a quality worth further examination. The unmaking had been suspended pending extended observation. 40 years. I laughed. I could not help it. I laughed in Elena's kitchen with the coffee going cold, and the morning light coming through the east-facing window in its particular gold, and the observer's form shifted in the way I had come to read as something approaching bewilderment, and Elena looked up from her own cup with the expression of someone waiting for the punchline. 40 years, I said. By your measure of time, the observer said. And if the consultation had gone the other way? The observer was quiet for a moment. Then we would have had an interesting conversation, Elena said. Good news? Yes, I said. And also more waiting. She considered this. That sounds like life, she said. The 40 years that followed were not a vigil. This is the thing the histories miss, in their effort to give the period the weight it deserves. They make it solemn, a holding pattern, a species on probation waiting to find out if it would be allowed to continue. That is not what it was. What it was life, which is the only thing it could have been, because life cannot hold its breath for 40 years. Life insists on itself. Life keeps finding things to argue about, and things to love, and things to make, and things to repair. The extended observation became, over the first decade, something no one had planned, a conversation. The 43 observers stayed, and more came. Slowly, over years, the number increasing to something closer to 400, distributed not just through major cities, but through small towns and rural communities, and the kinds of places that had never expected to be significant to anything. They were not conducting assessments. They were conducting something that looked, increasingly, like inquiry. They were attending to us with a quality of attention that was different from the original evaluation, less clinical, less distant, more like the attention of beings who have realized that what they are watching is more interesting than they had expected. Thomas Okafor became, in those years, one of the most significant conversations the observers sought out. He had no institutional role, no credentials in diplomacy or science. He was a retired history teacher who read the same book he had been reading for 60 years and found new things in it every time. He attended his church in Koreatown on Sundays and had coffee at the diner near it on weekday mornings. And the observers found him there with a regularity that his congregation eventually came to regard as a kind of miracle, depending on your framework. I had coffee with him often over those years. He was in his 80s by then, moving more slowly, thinking more carefully, with the specific quality of attention that comes from someone who has decided that the remaining time is too valuable to spend on things that do not matter. "Why did you say it was lonely?" I asked him once, years after the forum, when the observer said they'd resolved the underlying questions. He looked out the diner window at the Koreatown morning, the foot traffic, the shop fronts, the particular angle of LA light on a clear day. He thought for a long time. Because they'd stopped asking, he said, when you've found the answer to a question, you stop asking it. And questions are how you stay in conversation with something larger than yourself, whatever that larger thing is. When you stop asking, you're alone with your answers. Even if the answers are good ones. Even if the answers are true. Is that better or worse than being alone with your questions? Depends, he said, on whether you understand that you're alone. He picked up his coffee. They didn't know they were alone. That was the thing. They'd been alone for 4,000 years and never noticed. Because what do you measure loneliness against if you've never been surprised by something that required company? I thought about that for a long time. I thought about it for years, turning it over the way you turn over a question that has more angles than you can see at once. The Varath, over the extended observation period, did something that their own historical records had no category for. They changed their minds, not all at once, not unanimously. The divergence of position that had suspended the unmaking order deepened, over decades, into something the observers described to me, in various conversations, as a reconsideration of framework, a phrase that, in Varath terminology, apparently corresponded to something like a civilizational shift. The coherence they had achieved 4,000 years ago, the resolution of their fundamental contradictions, the settling of their deepest arguments, had always been understood within Varath culture as an arrival, as the destination that every sufficiently developed species was working toward, consciously or otherwise. The assessment framework was built on this premise. Species that had not yet arrived were being evaluated for the probability of their eventual arrival, and species for whom the probability was assessed as too low were being prevented from generating further instability in the interim. What the encounter with humanity, specifically the argument made on a Silver Lake sidewalk by a 26-year-old with cold coffee and a dead, scientist notes, had introduced was the possibility that arrival was not the only destination, that the space of possible cognitive architectures was larger than the Varath framework had accounted for, that a species could organize itself not around a settled answer, but around a sustained, committed, generative engagement with its own uncertainty, and that this was not failure of development, but a different development entirely, one with properties that the arrived architecture did not have and could not have. The word the observers eventually used, when they were explaining it to me in the 32nd year of the extended observation period, was complementary. The Varath and humanity were not on the same developmental axis with humanity behind. We were on different axes, and in a universe of the scale and age and complexity they had been tending for 4,000 years, there were things that the open architecture could encounter that the closed architecture could not. Questions that could only be asked by a species that did not already know the answer. The unmaking order was formally revoked in the 41st year. 17 languages, neutral accent, brief, But the content was different from anything the Varath had said before. Not a verdict, not an assessment. A statement of ongoing engagement. The Varath and humanity had. The assessment body concluded things to learn from each other. The relationship would continue under a new classification. The Varath terminology translated, approximately, as species with whom genuine surprise is still possible, which was, as Thomas Okafor said when I called to tell him, about the best thing you could say about anybody. He died at 91, 2 years before the formal revocation, in his church in Koreatown, in the middle of a hymn he had been singing since he was a child. The observer who had been attending the services for years was there. Afterward, a woman who had known Thomas for 30 years told me that she had watched the observer standing in the back throughout, and that its form had been doing something she had no word for, something she described as listening, and then amended to something like held, the specific quality of a presence that is wholly occupied with what is in front of it. I was 67 when the revocation was announced, and I was in Elena's studio when the transmission came through. She had finished the painting that she had been working on for 3 years. The ocean and the silver horizon and the small figure in the lower left corner, facing away, looking at something too large to be named, and had moved on to something new, a canvas that was mostly sky, an impossible blue, with something in the upper right that was still taking shape after all this time. We listened to the announcement together. When it ended, she looked at the canvas and then at me. Well, she said. Well, I said. She poured more coffee. I held the cup in the particular way you hold things that matter. Not tightly, just present, aware of the warmth, aware that the warmth is real. I am 89 years old now, and I live outside the city, in a house with good light and a view of the mountains and a shelf of books that have been read until their spines are soft. My garden is badly tended and well loved. On the wall of the main room hangs Elena's painting, the ocean, the figure, the horizon, which she gave me in the year after the revocation, and which has been looking at me ever since with the patient attention of something that has not finished telling me what it means. I think about Achibi sometimes, in the early mornings when the light is coming in and the coffee is still hot. About the diner on Sunset Boulevard, the cold toast, the way he looked at me when he said, "I'll know what to do with it." I do not think he knew what I would do with it. I think he knew it would matter, in some direction he could not specify, because that was the nature of the thing he had made. Not a solution, but a capacity. Not an answer, but the architecture to hold the question honestly. He wanted to build a bridge. What he built instead was someone who could stand in the gap and argue that the gap was the point. The gap is the country. This is the thing I have come to understand in 60 years of living in it, in 40 years of watching a civilization, 4,000 years older than mine, learn to find it interesting rather than alarming. The unresolved argument between our science and our aphith, between what we can measure and what we can feel, between the formula and the prayer, the molecule and the miracle, is not a wound the species is failing to close. It is the condition of remaining genuinely open, the condition of encountering the genuinely new and being changed by it, the condition of being alive in a universe that is always as larger than the last thing you measured it with. The Varath know this now, in the way that beings know things they have learned against the grain of their own certainty. With the specific quality of knowledge that has been earned rather than derived, that sits differently than the things you were always sure of. They do not find it comfortable, entirely. 4,000 years of coherence is not a thing you exit gracefully, but they are, in the specific sense that matters most, still in the conversation, still being surprised, still encountering in us things they did not already know. Last week, an observer came to the house in the late afternoon when the mountains were going purple and the light was amber and long. We sat. It does not sit exactly, but it occupies space in a way that functions as sitting, a posture of presence, and talked for an hour about nothing in particular. A question in astrophysics that had been bothering me, a piece of music I had been listening to, the way the garden was going in the front, with the roses that I kept trying to keep alive and kept not quite managing, and the stubborn small thing they did every spring of staying alive anyway, just barely, just enough. When it left, it paused at the door. The iridescent form caught the last of the amber light in its impossible way. All the colors that light at that wavelength should not be able to produce. You are still unusual, it said. I know, I said. The assessment stands. The form shifted in the way I had spent 6 decades learning to read. Fortunately, it said, the conclusion has changed. I watched it move down toward the road, through the last of the evening light, the not smoke catching color it had no right to catch. I went inside, made coffee, stood at the window with the steam rising from the cup and the mountains going dark in the distance, and Elena's painting on the wall Behind me, the figure at the edge of the ocean, facing away, looking at the thing that is too large to be named. The conversation, as far as I could tell, was not finished. I did not think it ever would be. That, I'd come to understand, standing on sidewalks and in diners and in the particular early morning light of a city that kept insisting on itself through everything, was exactly the point. Not the answer, not the arrival, not the coherence achieved and settled and maintained against all challenge. The conversation itself, the question that keeps generating the next question, the gap that keeps staying open. We are not the species that found the answer. We are the species that understood what the question was for. That is why we are still here. There is a thing they do not teach you about surviving the end of the world, which is that the end of the world takes a very long time and is mostly boring. I do not mean that dismissively. I mean it accurately. The 8 months between the announcement and the originally scheduled date of the unmaking were 8 months of ordinary time. Breakfast happened. Sunsets happened. People went to work because the alternative, not going to work, did not obviously improve the situation. And the human brain, faced with a catastrophe it cannot prevent through any available action, tends to default to the routines that have structured the available time up to now. Habit is a survival mechanism. Habit says, you have done this before and survived it, and the next morning came, and so maybe do this again. The panaderia on my corner had been open at 6 in the morning for 30 years. It kept opening at 6 in the morning. The owner, a man named Rogelio, whose family had been in the neighborhood since before I arrived, told me once, late in the second month after the announcement, when I stopped in for coffee and pan dulce, and found him behind the counter with the composed expression of someone who has been getting up at 4 in the morning his whole life and intends to keep doing so. That his grandmother had survived things he was not prepared to describe in detail. That her advice, delivered at the end of her life to her children and grandchildren, with the authority of someone who had earned the right to give it, was, keep the routine. The routine is not denial. The routine is the statement that you believe the morning will come, and that the morning is worth preparing for. Does she know about? I gestured vaguely upward, toward the general direction of the ships. She knows about everything, he says. She's 94. You think there's something new? I ate my pan dulce and went back to the apartment and thought about that for a long time. The second and third months brought a specific kind of activity that could be called, charitably, problem-solving, and could also be called, more accurately, the thing humans do when they cannot solve a problem but need to do something with their hands and their minds. The academic and scientific communities produced an extraordinary quantity of papers, studies, and proposals. Philosophers argued, theologians argued, scientists argued with theologians and then apologized and then argued again, because the situation did not lend itself to the kind of disciplinary détente that normally smooths professional discourse. The political apparatus of 30 nations convened in configurations that had not previously existed, signing agreements about cooperation and resource allocation that would, if the unmaking proceeded, have a relevance period of less than 8 months. I watched all of this with a specific quality of attention that I had been practicing, in one form or another, since a chibi had told me what I was. Not detachment. I was not detached. I was very much not detached. I was a 26-year-old person who loved people and did not want them to be unmade, but the kind of dual attention that a shichibi had been trying to describe in his theory, the capacity to be fully in the thing and also to see the shape of the thing, to feel the weight of it, and also to understand the weight as information. What I saw, watching humanity in the months after the announcement, was the thing that the Varath had apparently seen and interpreted as incoherence, and that I was beginning to understand differently. The arguments, the competing frameworks, the theologian in the panel discussion who said, with absolute conviction, that the Varath were an instrument of divine testing, and that the correct response was prayer, sitting next to the physicist who said, with equal conviction, that prayer was noise, and the correct response was a more rigorous analysis of the assessment criteria. Both of them right about something. Both of them seeing a real thing. Neither of them able to fully contain what the other was seeing, and neither of them, in honest moments, claiming to. The woman in my building who had lost her daughter to an illness 2 years before the Varath arrived and who kept a candle lit in her window, and who also, I learned this only by accident, overhearing a conversation, was the same woman who had been working with the Neighborhood Health Collective to document treatment outcomes for a medical trial with the same rigor and the same attention to the candle that never stopped burning. Not compartmentalization, not the management of contradiction by keeping it in separate boxes. The same woman, living in the full light of both, not because she had resolved the tension, but because she had decided the tension was not the enemy. This was what HFY had been reaching for, not people who had found the bridge, people who were the bridge, who could stand in the space between without needing it to be a corridor. In the 4th month, I started going to Thomas Okafor's church, not for the reasons you might expect, not for comfort, exactly, though I did not turn away comfort when it arrived. I went because Thomas had said they had coffee, and because Thomas was the only person I had met who had, in a spontaneous and unstrategic moment, said exactly the right thing to a being that could end the world, and I wanted to understand how that happened. The church was not large. It was not the kind of church designed to impress. It was the kind of church designed to hold people, which is different, and it held people well. A congregation that reflected the neighborhood in all its layers, which in Koreatown meant a kind of human mosaic that had been assembled over decades by the specific process of people with very different histories choosing to live in proximity and gradually, imperfectly, becoming a community. The coffee was in a room behind the main hall, served from a machine that was older than some of the congregation's children, and it was excellent coffee, which Thomas told me was the result of 30 years of insisting that the church could afford to buy the good beans. Thomas led a Sunday morning class for adults that he called, without irony, the hard questions class. This was not a class that provided answers. It was, deliberately and by design, a class that examined the texture and quality of the questions themselves. What makes a question worth asking? What is the difference between a question that opens and a question that closes? What does it mean to hold a question honestly without rushing to the answer that relieves the discomfort of not knowing? I attended the class. I sat in the back row with my cup of coffee and listened to a retired history teacher with a worn Bible led 30 people through an examination of uncertainty that was the most rigorous intellectual exercise I had encountered in 5 years of graduate school. And I thought, this is it. This is exactly what HFY was describing from the other direction. The scientist reaches for the unmeasurable. Because the measurable turns out to have edges. The believer reaches for the empirical because faith honest enough will not stop asking questions. They are reaching to port each other across a gap that cannot be closed, and in the reaching is the thing. Not the arrival. The reaching. In the 5th month, the observer began attending Thomas's class. It did not announce itself. It simply appeared one Sunday in the far corner of the room, occupying the space in its characteristic drift, and Thomas looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone who has been expecting a guest and is glad they arrived, and then continued the discussion, which happened to be about the nature of faith, specifically about what it means to believe something in the absence of proof, and whether the absence of proof was different from the presence of disproof, and whether certainty was the opposite of faith or just a different kind of it. The observer did not speak that first Sunday. It listened. The iridescent form was still, in a way it was not usually still, not the stillness of something waiting for the thing to end, but the stillness of something entirely occupied with what is present. Thomas told me afterward, over coffee, that he had felt it, not mystically, practically. The quality of attention in the room had changed when the observer arrived. Like adding a very good listener to a conversation, he said. The rest of the room talks better when they know someone is genuinely attending. What do you think it's getting from it? I asked. He thought for a while. I think, he said carefully, it's getting surprised, which I don't think has happened to it in a very long time. The observer started speaking in the 6th week it attended. Not during the discussion. It never interrupted, never redirected, never the class as a platform for anything other than listening. But after, when people were gathering their things and refilling their coffee, it began in a quiet way to ask questions. Not rhetorical questions, not procedural questions. Questions that had the specific quality of questions asked by someone who genuinely does not know the answer and has decided that not knowing is worth sitting with rather than resolving. You believe this? It said to a woman named Mary, who had spoken in the class about her experience of grief as a kind of unwilling teacher, even though it caused you suffering. Yes, she said. You would not prefer to have been spared the experience. I would have preferred not to have lost her, Mary said. The experience, what it made of me, no, I wouldn't trade it, even though the outcome was not under your control. Especially because the outcome was not under my control, she said. The things that were under my control, I shaped. The things that weren't, they shaped me. I don't get to decide which one I prefer. I only get to decide what I do with the shape I end up. The observer was quiet for a long time. The iridescence was doing the thing it had started doing in Thomas's class. The deeper stillness, the full occupation with the present. The Varath do not distinguish between those categories, it said at last. Shaping and being shaped are both managed within the coherent framework. The outcome of encounters is anticipated and integrated without distinction. That sounds very efficient, Mary said, with the dry warmth of someone who has learned to be kind even when they disagree. Yes, the observer said, and then, in the quiet way it had been developing for weeks. It may also explain something I have been attempting to understand about the gap in our predictive models. Mary looked at it. What gap? The gap, the observer said, between what we modeled you to do and what you did. This was the conversation, not the sidewalk argument, which was the moment. But this conversation, in a church coffee room in Koreatown, 3 weeks before the consultation ended, that I think of as the center of the story, not the dramatic center, the actual center, the place where the thing that was going to happen had already begun to happen. In the quiet way that the most important things begin, the observer had come to understand through 47 Sundays in Thomas Okafor's class and hundreds of coffee room conversations afterward that what it had initially assessed as incoherence was something it had no existing category for, not a failure to achieve coherence, not a developmental lag, an alternative architecture, a mode of being organized around the generative tension between incompatible frameworks, producing, in the friction between them, a capacity that neither framework alone could generate, the capacity to be genuinely changed by what you encounter. The Varath could receive data, they could update their models, but genuine change, the kind that requires the receiving entity to be different on the other side of the encounter, not just larger or more complex, but fundamentally reorganized, that required a kind of vulnerability to the world that their coherence had, eliminated, not deliberately, not as a flaw, as the necessary consequence of resolution. When you have found the answer, you stop being changed by the question. Humans had not found the answer. We were still being changed by the questions. And in a universe that was, it turned out, substantially larger and stranger and more generative than 4,000 years of careful observation had been able to fully map, the capacity to be changed by what you encounter was not a weakness. It was the most important thing there was. I was in the consultation room, a space the observers had established in a building in Westwood for the purpose of formal communications, when the decision was announced. The room was high-cylindringed and simply furnished, the kind of space that had been designed to be appropriate for a variety of circumstances, and therefore belonged fully to none of them. The observer I had spoken to most often in the preceding months stood near the window. The light was coming in from the west, the specific afternoon light of Los Angeles in late autumn, warm and slightly slant. The assessment body has concluded, it said, that the framework requires modification. I held my coffee cup. Not revision, it continued carefully. Expansion. The existing coherence-incoherence axis accounted for states of resolution and states of developmental progress toward resolution. It did not account for a third state, productive tension as an organizing principle. The absence of this category from our framework is itself diagnostic of the limitation the argument identified. You're saying the argument was right, I said. We are saying the argument was surprising, the observer said, in the specific sense that we were not able to anticipate it from within our existing framework, which is, as you will appreciate, a significant finding. I did appreciate it. I had been appreciating it, in the way you appreciate things before they have happened, for years. The unmaking order has been suspended, the observer said. Relationship between the Varath and humanity will continue under extended. Observation. This is not probationary. It is, the word in your language that is closest is probably partnership, though our terminology is more specific. We are proposing an ongoing relationship between species, whose respective architectures generate properties that neither architecture alone possesses. You're saying you need us, I said. The observer was quiet for a moment. We are saying, it said, with the specific quality it had developed over months in Thomas Okafor's class, the quality of a presence that has learned to sit with the difficult, honest thing, rather than the easier, smooth thing, that we had not previously understood the degree to which we did not know what we were missing. Outside, through the window, the late afternoon light was doing what it does on clear Los Angeles days, going amber and long, catching the dust in the air, making the ordinary look like something you should remember. The buildings of Westwood, the hills beyond, the specific quality of a city that has survived more things than it was designed to, and remains stubbornly, magnificently, absurdly itself. Can I ask you something? I said. Yes, the man at the forum, Thomas Okafor. When he said it sounded lonely, what happened? Inside your framework. What did that do? The observer was still for a long time. Long enough that I began to wonder if I had asked something unanswerable, something outside the territory of what could be honestly addressed. But it was thinking I had learned, genuinely thinking, in the way you think when you are trying to accurately describe something you have only recently understood. There was a gap, it said at last, in the model, between what we had predicted, a defense of the species, an argument for incoherence's developmental value, a plea for time, and what was said. He said something we had not anticipated, and the gap, the space between the prediction and the actuality, produced a state we had not registered since the coherence was achieved. What state? Curiosity, the observer said. It said the word carefully, the way you say a word in a language you are still learning, making sure you have the pronunciation right, not the processing of new data, not the integration of a new configuration. Something prior to that, the state of not knowing what the new thing will be and finding that not knowing, generative. Worth inhabiting. I thought about a chibi in the diner, about the toast we had not touched, about the way he had looked at me across the table, with the exhausted brightness of someone who has been carrying a theory for 30 years and has finally found someone to hand it to. The gap is the country. He taught you to be curious again, I said. The observer considered this. He demonstrated, it said, that curiosity was available. We had assumed it was not. We had assumed that coherence, once achieved, was a final state. He said one sentence that was not in our predictive models, and in the gap between the prediction and the sentence, we found something we had classified as resolved. It looked at me then, or did the thing its form did that I had been calling looking for years, the orientation and intensification that served the same function. You understand, it said, that this is why the argument worked, because it surprised you, because it surprised us in a way that the surprise itself demonstrated the argument's content. An argument for the value of genuine surprise delivered as a genuine surprise. The form and the content were identical. A pause. This is, in our experience of 4,000 years of assessments, unprecedented. I laughed again. I could not help it. Outside, the amber light was deepening toward the purple that precedes Los Angeles evening. In a diner in Koreatown, Thomas Okafor was probably finishing his second cup of coffee. In Silver Lake, Elena was probably adding something to the painting that would still be taking shape in 30 years. In a workshop behind a kitchen in Silver Lake, an old man was probably holding a watch that had stopped and deciding, with the patient confidence of someone who has made this decision 1,000 times, that it could be made to work again. The conversation continued. It has continued ever since. It will continue, I think, for as long as there are questions worth asking and beings willing to be changed by the answers. This is what I have come to understand. In 89 years of living in the gap, the contradiction is not the enemy. The settled answer is not the destination. The arrival is not the point. The point is the asking. The point is the morning that keeps coming, in a city that keeps insisting on itself, where the panaderia opens at 6, and the dog goes for its walk, and the woman with the paint-stained fingers keeps finding something in the lower left corner of a canvas that has not yet told her what it means. The point is sitting with the bird on the windowsill and not knowing whether it will fly, and staying anyway. The point is holding the cup of coffee until it goes cold, because the conversation is worth more than the coffee, and then making more coffee, because the conversation will go on. We did not survive because we were strong enough to fight. We survived because we were unresolved enough to surprise. And the universe, it turns out, has been waiting a very long time for something it could not predict. There were, in the years of extended observation, a number of things that the history books record in the abstract, the way things that actually happen get recorded when the people writing the record were not there. I want to give you one of them concretely, because the concrete things are the ones that hold the weight. In the 19th year of the extended observation period, there was a meeting in Geneva that brought together, for the first time in any formal setting, a significant number of Verith observers and a cross-section of human specialists, not diplomats, not scientists, not any particular class of expert, but a group assembled for the specific property of breath. Physicists sat next to theologians, painters sat next to engineers, a woman who studied folklore, a man who had spent 40 years documenting dying languages, an architect who had spent 30 years designing buildings for communities displaced by floods. The meeting was not called a summit. It was called, in the gentle euphemism of people who had learned to be careful about naming things before they understood them, an exchange. The Verath observers attended in larger numbers than any previous gathering, 15 of them, which was understood to be significant, though the significance was unclear until the exchange was well underway. What the exchange turned out to be was simple. Each person asked to bring one thing, one question, one idea, one piece of work, one piece of themselves that was most essentially human, in the sense of being most essentially unresolved, sat with one or more of the observers and talked. Not presented. Talked. In the way you talk when you are trying to explain something you care about to someone who genuinely wants to understand it. The folklorist talked about stories that had survived for 10,000 years because they kept changing, stories that remained themselves while becoming different, that held their identity through transformation rather than through fixity. She had found a story about a bird and a river that appeared in 47 distinct cultural traditions on 5 continents. Never identical, always recognizable. She had spent 20 years trying to understand how a story moved through the human world like that, changing as it went, and had concluded, after all those years, that she was not sure it was the same story. She was not sure that was a problem. The observer she was speaking with was still for a long time after she finished. Then it said, "In our culture, stories that change are considered corrupted." Corrupted from what? The folklorist asked. From the original, the observer said. But stories don't have originals, she said. They have tellings. The original is just the first telling we know about, which usually isn't actually the first. Another long pause. "This is a fundamental category difference," the observer said, in the tone of someone making a note to themselves of extraordinary importance. "Yes," the folklorist said. "I think that's why I do what I do." The architect talked about buildings designed for communities that did not expect to stay in one place. Buildings that could be rebuilt in new locations with the same structural logic, the same organizing principles, different materials, different specific forms. Buildings that expressed their identity through adaptability rather than through permanence. He had worked with 12 different communities over 30 years on 5 continents and had learned a thing he had not expected to learn, that the communities for which he had designed most successfully were not the ones that most wanted to preserve what they had. They were the ones that were most willing to understand what they had and carry the essence of it into a new form. "We have buildings that are 4,000 years old," the observer said. "I know," the architect said. "Are they the same buildings?" The observer considered. "They have been maintained, repaired, original materials replaced as they deteriorated. So they're ships of Theseus," the architect said. A pause. "I am not familiar. It's a philosophical puzzle. If you replace every plank of a ship, one by one, over a long enough time, is it still the same ship?" "Yes," the observer said immediately. "The design is continuous. The identity is structural." "Right," the architect said. "Now, what if the design changed, but the community living in it stayed the same?" The longest pause of the exchange. "That," the observer said, "is a question we have not asked. I was not present at the Geneva exchange. I heard about it afterward in detail from 3 different people who had attended. What struck me about every account, from every different perspective, was the same note. The observers, across 15 separate conversations in a single afternoon, encountered the same thing over and over from different angles. The human capacity to identify with continuity of spirit rather than continuity of form, to be the same thing in different configurations, to carry identity through change rather than despite it. The Verath, across 4,000 years of coherence, had maintained their identity through fixity. They were the same. Their answer was the same. Their framework was the same. The only thing that changed was their accumulation of data within the framework. Humans were the opposite. We maintained our identity through transformation. We were ourselves in 100 different forms, 1,000 different configurations, across every catastrophe and every reformation and every generation that remade the language and the stories and the buildings, but kept, somehow, the particular human quality of insisting on being here, on finding it interesting, on making things and then making different things and calling both of them by the same name. We were the story that changed and remained recognizable. This was, it turned out, exactly what the universe needed. Not metaphorically, literally. The Verath, in the 32nd year of the extended observation period, brought to the humans in the partnership a problem they had been working on for 800 years and had been unable to solve. I am going to simplify it, because the actual problem is technical beyond any reasonable summary, but the simplified version captures the essential structure. They had encountered, at the edge of one of the systems they maintained, a phenomenon that did not fit their framework. Not a gap in the data, a gap in the framework itself. A place where the coherent, resolved, 4,000-year-old understanding of how the universe worked produced a prediction that the universe declined to fulfill. They had been working on it for 8 centuries by adding more data, refining their models, improving their instruments. Nothing had resolved it. They brought it to a working group of human physicists and philosophers and one theologian, Thomas Okafor's successor at the church in Koreatown, a woman named Dr. Patience Amara, who had a doctorate in physics and taught Sunday school on weekends, and had never seen a contradiction between those two activities. The working group spent 6 months on it. What they produced was not a solution in the sense the Varath expected. It was not a refinement of the existing framework that resolved the anomaly within the established terms. What they produced was a question, a specific, carefully formulated question about whether one of the foundational assumptions of the Varath framework was an assumption rather than a demonstrated fact. The assumption was approximately 4,000 years old. The Varath spent 7 years examining it. I will not claim to understand what they found in those 7 years, because the understanding required is beyond mine. What I know is the outcome. The assumption was, in fact, an assumption, an inference so old and so foundational that it had been classified as established knowledge. And when it was reclassified as an open question, the anomaly resolved itself within 6 months. 800 years. The problem had been waiting 800 years for someone who could look at a 4,000-year-old assumption and see it as a question. How did they find it? I asked Dr. Amara when she came to the house in the hills for coffee in the spring after the resolution. She was a trim woman in her early 50s with the specific quality of attention I had come to associate with people who were genuinely comfortable with not knowing, a quality that looked, from outside, like calm and was, from inside, something more active than calm. The willingness to remain present with the uncertain thing. We asked what we would have to believe for the model to be right, she said. And then we asked what we would have to believe for the anomaly to be right. And then we asked which set of beliefs had been examined more recently. That's it? That's it, she said. It's not complicated. It's just the thing you can only do if you're not committed to the existing answer. The Verth couldn't do it. They weren't wrong, she said, with the fairness of someone who understood the structure of other people's limitations. They were coherent. Coherence means the framework is internally consistent. It doesn't leave room for the question, what if the framework is wrong? There's no position within the framework from which to ask that, because asking it is already outside the framework, and we had the position. We had the habit, she said. We've been asking, what if everything we know is wrong, since the first time someone told us not to eat a particular fruit, and we ate it anyway. It's not our best quality, but it turns out it's a useful one. She looked out at the garden, where the roses were doing what they did every spring, not quite dying, not quite thriving, occupying the specific middle territory of things that are stubbornly alive despite inadequate care. I think about something Thomas Okafor said, she said. He said the questions were how you stayed in conversation with something larger than yourself. I think that's what happened with the Varath problem. The question was the door. We were still able to open it because we hadn't sealed it. The sun was going. The mountains were going purple. The house was warm with the particular warmth of a place that has been lived in well, and the coffee was good, and the conversation was the kind that does not feel like it should end. I am 89 years old. I have spent 63 years in a relationship with beings who could have unmade everything I love, and I have watched that relationship become something neither side could have predicted from the starting point, and I have learned, slowly, the way you learn things that are not available to be taught but only to be lived, that the inability to predict the destination is not a flaw in the traveler. It is the condition of the journey being worth taking. Achibi was right in the end. He built a bridge. He was wrong about what the bridge would do. He thought it would carry people from the empirical to the numinous and back, that it would resolve the tension by making the crossing easy. What the bridge did, instead, was stand in the gap and point to the gap and say, look at this. Look at what is here, in this space that neither side could fully occupy. Look at what has grown in it. The world did not end on a Tuesday. The world kept going the way it does in all its noisy and contradictory and gorgeous insistence, right up to the point where an alien civilization 4,000 years older than our oldest writing looked at us and found, to its own great surprise, that we were interesting. The bird flew. I did not know it would, but I stayed. And the morning came and the coffee was hot and the mountains were there in the light. And the conversation was not finished. And that, all of it, the whole mess and beauty and stubborn refusal of the ordinary to stop being extraordinary, was exactly the point. I think about Elena's painting often. The one she gave me in the year after the revocation, which hangs on the wall in the main room of the house and has been looking at me for 22 years with the patient quality of something that is not finished saying what it is saying. The ocean, the silver horizon, The small figure in the lower left corner, facing away, looking at the thing that cannot be named from this distance. She told me once, when I asked, that she had not planned the figure. She had been painting the ocean for 2 years, and the figure had appeared one morning as she was working in the lower quadrant of the canvas, and once it was there she understood that it had always been going to be there. The way you understand, sometimes, that the thing you have been moving toward was the destination all along, even though you didn't know the destination when you started. Who is it? I asked her. I think, she said, it's you. I looked at the small back, the composed posture, the sense of looking at something too large to be contained in the frame. I look like that from behind? You look like that all the time, she said. Like you're looking at something too large and you've decided that's fine. I thought about the pier, the morning the ship came down, about the coffee she poured into the ocean, the purposeful walk back toward shore, about the way she had watched me and the observer from her doorway that first Tuesday morning, without appearing to find it remarkable, the same calm attention she brought to her painting, the same willingness to see what was there without deciding in advance what it should be. You knew, didn't you, I said. When you saw us on the sidewalk that first morning, you knew it was going to work out. She considered this with the deliberateness she brought to questions that deserved it. I knew, she said at last, that you were going to try, and I knew that trying was the only thing that ever worked. Not success. I didn't know that part. But trying. She looked at the painting. The figure is looking at the ocean. The ocean is very large. She doesn't know if she can cross it. That's not actually the question. What's the question? Whether she goes in, Elena said. She went back to work. The new canvas was still in progress. The impossible blue sky, the something in the upper right that had been taking shape for years and had not yet finished. I stood in her studio and looked at the back of the figure on the old canvas, and thought about the bird on the windowsill, and thought about the toast that went cold in the diner, and thought about a column of iridescent smoke standing in a church coffee room in Koreatown, learning to be curious again after 4,000 years. She went in. We all went in. The ocean was exactly as large as it looked. We crossed it anyway. There is one more thing I want to tell you. In the 43rd year of the extended observation period, 3 years before the formal revocation, an observer came to the house in the hills on a winter evening when the rain had been falling for 2 days, and the mountains were invisible in the low cloud, and the world had the specific quality that wet winter evenings give it, enclosed, close, everything nearby made more present by the inability to see what is far. I had been sitting by the window with a book and a glass of wine that had been sitting next to me for an hour while I forgot to drink it, which is a habit I have had my whole life and have decided is not worth changing. The knock, the observers had learned to knock, which was one of the small things that had happened over the years that I found more moving than the large ones, was quiet. The observer came in and stood in the entry in the way it had, over decades, evolved to accommodate the space of indoor rooms. Slightly smaller than its outdoor form, the iridescence somehow dimmer and at the same time more present, the way candlelight is dimmer and more present than daylight. I want to tell you something, it said. All right, I said. It is personal, it said. Not official, not on behalf of the assessment body. Personal is a sense that it arises from my own observation over many years. I am not certain the Varath have a framework for personal communication of this kind. I am going to attempt it anyway. All right, I said again. It was quiet for a moment. The rain was at the windows, the specific sound of a rain that has settled in for a long time and is not in a hurry. When I first began attending the Sunday class, it said, I did not understand what I was there for. The assessment had concluded. The observation was a formal process. I was there to observe, but I found over weeks and then months that something was happening that was not in the category of observation. I was not merely receiving data. I was being affected by the conversations, by the specific way Thomas Okafor listened to people, by the thing that happened in the room when someone said something true. Yes, I said, I did not have a category for this, it said. For a long time, I attempted to classify it as a data artifact, an imprecision in my observation process, something to be corrected. I spent considerable effort attempting to return to a position of pure observation, undisturbed by the content of what I was observing. A pause. I was not successful. What did you decide? I asked. I decided, the observer said, with the specific quality it had developed over years of honest conversation, that the inability to remain undisturbed was not a flaw in my observation process. It was evidence that what I was observing was the kind of thing that requires presence, not distance, that the only way to understand it was to be in it, that true observation in this context meant being affected. I held the wine glass I had not been drinking. Thomas would have liked hearing that. I said. I know, it said. I regret that I did not say it when he was still here to hear it. I believed at the time that personal communication of this kind was outside my appropriate function. I was wrong. I understand now that it was within my appropriate function. It was, in fact, part of what I was here to do. It looked at me then, with the full orientation and intensity that I had been looking for 40 years, the closest the form could come to the direct, present regard of one being fully attending to another. I wanted to tell you, it said, that the conversation changed me. Not the formal conversation, the argument on the sidewalk, the consultation, the revocation, those were events. The conversation I mean is the one that has been happening in coffee rooms and living rooms, and on sidewalks and at kitchen tables for 40 years. The conversation that had no agenda except to be honest. That changed me. That changed, I will use the word now without qualification, because I believe it is accurate. That changed us. The Vareth who will enter the next 4,000 years are not the Vareth who arrived over your ocean 40 years ago. The rain was very quiet. Is that good or bad? I asked, because I had been asking that question for 40 years and the answer was still not simple. It is, the observer said. What is? I thought about my mother on the phone, the morning I told her I was going to try. The equanimity in her voice. Not the equanimity of someone who doesn't care, but of someone who has decided that caring and accepting are not opposites, that you can love something completely, and also understand that some of what happens to it is outside your control, and that the love does not shrink to accommodate that understanding. I believe in you. Does that count? Yes, I said. I think that's right. The observer stayed for another hour, which was unusual. We did not talk about the assessment or the revocation or the partnership between species. We talked about the rain and about a piece of music I had been listening to, the same composition I had been listening to for 20 years, by the other Clarity child who had become a composer, who had spent her life making things that lived in the gap between the mathematical and the emotive that could not be explained by either framework alone and were diminished by the attempt. We talked about the mountains, invisible in the cloud, still there. When it left, the rain had eased to a drizzle. The mountains were still invisible, but the cloud was lighter, the specific lightness that precedes clearing. The observer moved down toward the road in the dimmed light, and at the point where the road turned, and it would have been lost to sight, it paused. It did not look back. It did not need to. The pause was its own form of acknowledgement, the Vareth equivalent of a hand raised, a nod, the small human gesture that says, I was here, and this was real, and I will carry it. Then it was gone, and the rain was very light, and the mountains would be there in the morning. I finished the wine. It had gone warm, sitting untouched for so long. It was still good. Some things are still good after they have waited. Some things are better for it. I went to sleep. In the morning, the mountains were there.